Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile discussion. Patch 3.20 is going to bring about some significant changes to curses, specifically hex curses. So these are the ones that you cast that by default target an area, but in practice most people apply them via other means. These are going to be changed substantially. They're going to have their numbers rebalanced, and the intention that GGG are going for here is that a number of the esoteric sources of curse effect that exist in the game will be removed. And once this has been done, it then becomes possible to rebalance hexes, broadly speaking, upwards, because they no longer need to be held down because of the potential for them to completely trivialize gameplay when someone completely specializes into them. In short, this manifesto will be a nerf to people who are using a Cursebot in a multiplayer party, and will probably represent a buff if you're playing the game in any other way, although we're going to need to see some of the exact details to be certain on this. The very quick summary of what's being changed: hidden monster penalties against curses and hexes are being removed. Hexes are now stronger against unique monsters and twice as strong against pinnacle bosses, but are weaker against trash monsters than they've been in the past, which actually isn't really that big a deal because most of the time you didn't care about getting a hex on a weaker enemy because they generally weren't all that strong. The Doom mechanic's been removed to simplify hexes. Anything related to Doom has been reworked so it's comparable to before. The Occultist Ascendancy has had some stats removed and moved around to counteract some of the power gain that it's getting, because the Occultist is already one of the best Ascendancies in the game. Enfeeble and Temporal Chains have been buffed. To aid these above changes, some less accessible sources of curse effect have been removed. This also acts as a nerf to very dedicated hex support builds. Hex gems have been rebalanced with the goal of ensuring that self-cast remains relevant compared to automatic curse application. We've buffed a number of unique items with hex interactions and reworked unique items that previously interacted with Doom, and we're adding some new powerful unique items that interact with hexes. And when you see Anathema, the new ring, you will see exactly what they mean when they say these things are powerful. So now let's break everything down. Firstly, there's some discussion of the hidden mechanics that nerf hexes on various bosses. So currently, hexes are at their best when they're used against weak monsters, and at their worst when they're used against strong monsters. This is partly because hexes have hidden penalties, reducing their effectiveness when fighting unique monsters and pinnacle bosses. Currently, curses have 33% less effect on regular bosses. These penalties were introduced after someone found a way to cause Uberatsuri to completely stop. This is a point where Uberatsuri was the top boss in the game, and there was a way that you could use Blasphemy, Temporal Chains, and a certain set of items to cause Atsuri to be completely unable to move, which was somewhat ridiculous to say the least. Now, it's normal for these monsters to have various hidden penalties, as noting every single one would cause a lot of clutter in their mod descriptions. Players can reasonably expect these monsters to be more difficult to fight, so in general, showing the entire list of penalties is not very necessary. However, the penalty against hexes is an outlier because it's much more significant compared to other hidden penalties. Because it's so substantial while also being hidden from players, it's unlikely to be compensated for during build creation. At least it's unlikely to be compensated for during build creation by people who don't know all the ins and outs of the game, and it creates a notable disadvantage for builds that use hexes a lot. We've removed both of these penalties so that hexes will be consistently effective against all monsters in the game. I do think it's worth noting that a hex-like flammability, which nerfs a monster's fire resistance, is actually stronger when it's applied to a monster that has more fire resistance. For example, if a monster has 50% fire resistance and you inflict a 25% reduction in that fire resistance, dropping it from plus 50% to plus 25%, that's a 50% more multiplier in the damage that you're doing to that monster. On the flip side, if that monster had 0% base resist and you inflicted a 25% penalty on it, then that's a 25% more multiplier. If that monster had 75% fire resistance and you inflicted a 25% reduction, then that's actually a doubling, a 100% more multiplier in the amount of damage you're doing. It's worth keeping that effect in mind. This is definitely going to make hexes that attack monster resistances more powerful against any monster that you're likely to need to hit 10 or more times with your main skill in order to kill it. That's going to make those hexes significantly better against those monsters. And because pinnacle bosses do generally have higher resistances than most trash monsters in the game, that effect is going to be even more pronounced on them. The next thing GGG go into is the Doom mechanic. So the Doom mechanic was added as a way to make hexes better when they're cast manually. However, it hasn't really achieved that. The idea is that a hex would start at 100% effect and then would build up to 140% over time while it remains on that monster. In practice though, it was too much hassle and was never really worth it except on dedicated Cursebot builds. So this mechanic is basically getting removed. Doom is being removed, and as a consequence, there will be changes to other mechanics that previously interacted with Doom. For example, stats that reference Doom have been replaced with other curse-themed stats. Hexblast has had its skill mechanics and damage adjusted to account for the loss of Doom's scaling. Impending Doom support has had its base damage roughly doubled to compensate for this loss. And the Doomsday Keystone is being replaced with a new Hex-themed Keystone that's not yet been revealed. Curse-related uniques are getting overhauled. We've buffed a number of Hex-related unique items and have reworked uniques that previously interacted with Doom, such as the Fated End unique ring. We've also added some new unique items that interact with hexes. This is Anathema and it is powerful. This looks like an incredibly strong ring. I'm expecting that this will be tier 1 rarity. This does not feel like an accessible item, or maybe it's going to be a drop from a significant boss. So being a Moonstone ring base, it grants you a bit of energy shield. There's a fair chunk of intelligence and cast speed on it. 13% increased cast speed is pretty good. 16% chance to gain a power charge when you cast a curse spell is significant on some builds and not others. But the big deal, your curse limit is equal to your maximum power charges. By default, this is going to be 3, but with a little bit of investment, you can get this to 4 or 5 or even 6 or more. And this is going to provide you with a tremendous number of additional curses that you can inflict on a single monster. One of the key use cases for Anathema that I see is in conjunction with Blasphemy in order to apply a large number of curses to a single monster, softening it up considerably before you start trying to beat it down. And Anathema seems like it will be the lowest opportunity cost way to get 3 curses as your limit, but also can be used to get 4 or 5 if you're willing to invest more in applying lots of curses at once with Bane. I think this ring will be very, very strong. Secondly, Heretic's Veil is getting buffed again. This item was nerfed a while ago. It's now being buffed back to roughly what it used to be. Plus 2 to level of socketed curse gems. Socketed gems are still supported by level 22 Blasphemy. They now get 30% reservation efficiency, up from 20% like they used to be. And then there's still a few other stats on the item as well. Heretic's Veil was pretty dominant for a period. It then got nerfed. That nerf on its own wouldn't have killed it, but that was also about the same time as a number of other changes that meant that it just got left behind. Heretic's Veil may well be back, although I'm less confident that this will be widely used than I am for Anathema. The next section of the Balanced Manifesto talks about ensuring that self-casting hexes is actually viable. So in most cases, builds that facilitate somewhat automated gameplay, like Hex Touch applying hexes automatically, should either come at a higher cost or be less effective. In some cases, both are needed to counterbalance the significant upside of automation. Otherwise, the option to automate will always be the obvious choice and will eclipse more interactive gameplay styles. The Doom mechanic was aimed at fulfilling this function for hexes, and it's being replaced by alternative, simpler solutions. We are applying penalties to both Blasphemy and Hex Touch supports, which will grant less curse effect at all gem levels. Additionally, item mods that inflict a specific hex no longer do so with increased effect. This includes items where the hex is meant to be a downside on the player, such as Coward's Chains, Coward's Legacy, or Soul Mantle. So in short, self-casting is being buffed, automating is being buffed and nerfed simultaneously, and I'm assuming that they're trying to get it roughly where it is now. But we'll see exactly where they land when we get the patch notes in a few days' time. Hex skill gem scaling. So this section starts talking about some of those changes to hex gems that are coming, and particularly talking about how these gems scale differently with gem levels. And they're wanting to try and standardize this a bit. So currently, Vulnerability and Despair are much more powerful than others when they're used at level 1. And this is because all of these hex on hit modifiers currently apply a level 1 version of the hex. Some hexes are very strong at level 1 relative to their level 20 power because they scale less with level. This means that in some cases, using hex on hit is potentially very powerful, alongside a benefit of applying hexes automatically. We're stabilizing gem scaling rates of hexes. In general, they should be twice as powerful at gem level 20 than they are at gem level 1. This is a pretty big deal here, but the devil is in details that we don't have, and that will likely not come until we get either the patch notes in a few days' time, or maybe until a separate post is made about various overhauled gems that are going to be coming in the new patch. We'll have to see more details there. Scaling curse effect. GGG currently feel there are too many sources of curse effect available, and it's created a large power gap between players that have no investment in curses and those that have heavy investment in curses, which has continually caused them to keep the baseline power of curses to be lower than they'd like. We're regulating the number of sources of cursed effect throughout the game. This will rein in the power of players who are building curse support characters. These changes are being focused on less accessible sources of curse effect. Now, GGG mentioned here Eldritch Implicits on helmets, which I don't think are a particularly inaccessible source of power. I would have thought if you were going to compare to one really hard to get source of curse effect, you would have mentioned Labyrinth Enchants. Labyrinth Enchants that provide things like Temporal Chains effect are very hard to get. compared to something like a grand tier or even an exceptional or exquisite or perfect tier of the Eldritch Implicit. Curse effect notables on clusters have been replaced with other appropriate ones. For example, the one that used to grant flammability effect now causes your flammability hex to apply to hexproof enemies and also causes your ignites on cursed enemies to deal damage faster. The Occultist Ascendancy. The Occultist Ascendancy is getting a couple of nerfs that are intended not to be an overall nerf to the Ascendancy, but to maintain its current power in a world where curses are generally better. Don't know if they'll get that exactly right, but that's the intention here. They're removing the 15% increased curse effect, and enemies you curse have malediction stats from malediction, and then they're moving your hexes can affect hexproof enemies from Profane Bloom to malediction. Malediction will be renamed because it's no longer going to apply malediction to enemies you curse. Due to the significant increase in power of hexes against tougher monsters, the effects of this notable are still very strong, as the removal of the hex penalty cannot be understated. This massive buff to hexes especially applies to occultists because they have access to more hexes than other ascendancies. The curse effect removed from the notable, previously known as malediction, has been moved to the passive skill tree, where it's available to everyone. This is important because while the occultist is still the strongest overall ascendancy for someone who wants to specialize in applying many hexes, GGG don't want it to feel mandatory to play an occultist for someone who merely wants to apply really strong hexes. Temporal Chains and Enfeeble. The current balance of Temp Chains and Enfeeble makes them exceedingly strong against normal and magic monsters, while being relatively ineffective against pinnacle bosses. For example, level 20 Temp Chains gem currently reduces a pinnacle boss's action speed by 4%, and you can get twice as much action speed reduction just by using any skill that applies chill. Another case of hexes being weakest where they matter most, and strongest where they matter least. Because of the changes to curse effect, we're now able to make Temp Chains and Enfeeble strong defensive options without requiring large investment into curse effect. In addition to changes to their overall gem levels and scaling, we're also planning to increase the cursed rare and unique enemies have X% less action speed modifier on Temp Chains, as well as increasing the cursed rare and unique enemies deal X% less damage modifier on Enfeeble. This, I think, is going to really shake up the meta because it's going to provide a new type of defense that hasn't really been viable for a long time, and that is going to be double Blasphemy, Temp Chains, Enfeeble. I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing a fair number of builds dropping one of the classic defensive auras in order to pick up Temp Chains and Enfeeble as auras. We're going to have to see how this plays out in practice. Maybe it's better to keep Grace, maybe it's better to go this new way, but at the very least, it's going to be something new that we can explore and see how well it works. This will be particularly good, I think, in conjunction with the Heretic's Veil that's been reworked, although there may be other options as well. Do be aware that if you want to do this setup, you will need to increase your curse limit somehow, and you may want to use that new unique ring Anathema as a way to do that, but it may not be the only way to do so. Vulnerability and Despair. While working on the updates outlined above, we took the opportunity to make some stat changes to Vulnerability and Despair to help make these gems cleaner. They're now more focused on making enemies vulnerable to physical and chaos damage in ways that are generically useful for any build dealing primarily chaos or physical damage. We'll confirm the specifics of these changes in the 3.20 expansion patch notes. Now, fair warning, this is going to change one of the most deadly map mods, which is players are affected by vulnerability, and we don't know how it's going to do so. It may make those maps easier than they are now, it may make them harder. We'll have to see exactly how that turns out, but for now, I am thinking it will probably make them easier. Hexblast. Hexblast has had its skill mechanics and damage adjusted to account for the loss of Doom scaling. Broadly speaking, it now does less damage at the very top end of gameplay, but getting it to a fairly decent level of damage is easier than before. It now removes a random hex from an enemy and will deal more damage with hits and ailments if a hex was removed in this way. Its damage is now also more consistent because you no longer need to wait for Doom to build up. Conclusion. In general, hexes will be stronger against tough monsters and weaker against lesser monsters. We've removed Doom in order to simplify how hexes worked, introduced penalties to automated hex application methods to keep them from outclassing self-casting, and made several other balance changes as a consequence of these overall tweaks. Please note that these are still subject to change in the lead up to the launch of the Forbidden Sanctum expansion, and we'll reveal specifics of these changes in the patch notes. So there's a lot to go through there, but broadly speaking, I'm interested to see how this works in practice. I think that this probably makes double Blasphemy a viable choice again, and also potentially it could be very strong to apply Enfeeble and Temporal Chains defensively through some mechanic like Bane, or even simply through manually casting both of them. In particular, I think this manifesto offers a lot to characters that already invest heavily in skill effect duration increases and or increases to area of effect, as this is going to mean that you'll have more application uptime from your various hexes that you're using, and those hexes will be better. You'll definitely want to reassess how you're using them and potentially invest more in hexes after this manifesto. That said, some of the devil's in the details we don't know as yet, and we will hopefully get more information on that over the next few days. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.